If you're a budding web designer and you're ready to learn CSS, then start here. Now, the CSS courses in our Start Here series are going to teach you everything that you need to know in order to become a solid CSS coder. And we're going to begin with a focus on typography. We're going to start by introducing you to CSS itself. We'll give you all the foundational information that you need to follow along comfortably with all the CSS we cover in this series. Then we're going to move into CSS Typography, where you're going to learn about CSS Font Properties. You're going to learn about web-safe fonts, custom fonts, and font stacks. You'll learn about spacing in typography. You'll learn about the different type of units that you can use when you're setting out your typography. And then finally, you're going to take a basic HTML page just like the one that you created in the previous course, and you're going to completely style its typography from scratch. So let's go ahead and start here and learn typography CSS. I'll see you in the first lesson. Hi, this is Kez Bracey. Welcome to Start Here, Learn Typography CSS. Now, this is the second course in our Start Here series. And the last course, you learned the basics of HTML, and this is what you created. It's a simple HTML page using all the most common HTML elements. However, as you can see, it's still just basically black and white. There's no unique look and feel, there's no styling. And that's where CSS comes into play. A CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And the most important word in there that you want to pay attention to is style. CSS is what you use to add style to a page that would otherwise just have plain content. So in this series, we're going to have 3 courses on CSS. And this first one is going to be concentrating on typography. After that, we'll move on to layout. And then finally, we'll move on to coloring. But before we can do any of that, we need to give you an introduction to what CSS is and the most important parts of working with it. So in this lesson, we're going to go through what CSS is, the kind of effects that it can have on a website, and we're going to step through the essentials of CSS syntax. And then that information will carry you through this course and the 2 courses that we have coming up after that. So the best way to understand the effect of CSS is just to see what it can do. So to give you a little reference and a little bit of basis of comparison, way back in the day, we never used to have CSS. If you wanted to make a website look good, basically what you had to do was you had to create a design in Photoshop, and then you had to cut it into pieces, and each one of those pieces had to sit inside a table cell. And often because you would use graphics to do things like headings to make sure that they looked nice, you wouldn't even have text that was readable by search engines. But then along came CSS, and it gave you ways to make your designs look nice and to make everything still search engine readable without needing to depend heavily on embedded graphics. And when CSS first came onto the scene, one of the first sites that's still around today that showed everybody the power that it had was CSS Zen Garden. Now you'll notice here, this is our HTML page that we made in the last course. Now this is CSS Zen Garden with no CSS applied. As you can see, it looks quite similar to what we had by the end of our HTML basics course. Just plain, black and white with all the appearance set to default. Now this is CSS Zen Garden with CSS applied. As you can see, it's very, very different. You have color, you have font styling, you have background images, you have style. Now the cool thing about CSS is all of your styling code can be placed into a self-contained document, a style sheet. And that style sheet is separate from your HTML. So what that means is you can apply a new style sheet to the same HTML and have a completely different style for your site. Now, if you go to CSS Zen Garden and you have a browse through all of these links down the side, these are all applications of different style sheets to this exact same original HTML. Now let's have a look at some of the examples. So this is one example, looking obviously completely different to the one that we just saw. Here's another example. Now all the HTML is exactly the same. The only thing that has changed is the CSS. So here's another one. Completely different every time. So CSS allows you to keep your HTML exactly the same, but have an utterly different style applied to the website. So looking at that, you can see the kind of power that CSS has. All right, so now let's move on to the basics of how CSS works. And just like we did in the last course when we're starting to look at how HTML works, we're going to use the Chrome DevTools Inspector. So go to csszengarden.com. Now scroll down until you can see both of these headings here. And then right-click one and inspect it. And then just adjust so you can still see both of these headings. All right, so now we can have a look and we can see here that these headings are both H3 headings. We'll check this one too. That's also an H3. Now over in the Styles tab on the right, we can see the CSS that's been applied. Now this code here comes straight out of the attached style sheet, which is this file here. And if you want to have a look at the whole file, you can open that up in a new tab. And this is all the CSS code that has been applied to this website. And there's our H3 code. So we'll just head back and keep looking in our inspector. All right, so now if I change any one of the properties in here, if I change any of the code here, it's going to affect every H3 element on this page. For example, here we've got the font size specified for our H3 headings. Now if I change that, watch the font size of the headings change. So I've increased that from 1.8 to 2.5, and now all of the H3 headings have increased in size. So the basic format that you've got here is first you have a selector. So this is going to select every H3 element on this page and apply all of this styling here that's in between this opening curly bracket and closing curly bracket. And in between those curly brackets, you have CSS properties on the left here in red, and then you have their corresponding values on the right. Now, the one that we just changed and something you'll be looking at closely in this course is the font size. So on the left here, we have the font size property, and on the right, we have a value of 2.5M. Now, something to pay attention to here is you'll notice that after every one of the properties on the left, there's a colon. And after every value, there's a semicolon. And that's how you prevent one rule from just running into the next rule. That's how you separate each part of your CSS. So to recap so far, you start with a selector, then you put opening and closing curly brackets. Inside that, you place a property followed by a colon and then a value followed by a semicolon. Now with this code, the selector that we're looking at is an element. And you're familiar with elements from the last course. We went through working with H3 elements, paragraph elements, and a few different others as well. But that's just one type of selector that exists in CSS. The other that you'll be using most commonly is classes. Now let's just drag our window up a little bit and have a look at some classes. Now you can see as you go through this code here, you can see this attribute multiple times, class. Now whenever you see that, the name that is specified as the value of the class attribute should match up with a selector that you find inside your CSS. So here we've got a div with the class participation, and then sure enough, over on the right, in our Styles tab, we can see a selector div with the class participation. Now the way that you recognize a class in CSS is that there is always a dot in front of it. If there's no dot, then the selector is just a straight element, like this one here. There's no dot here, so we know that this style is just going to apply to every single div element. But in this style, there's a dot before the word participation right here. So that means that this style is going to apply wherever we see this participation class applied to a div. Now, if that feels a little bit overwhelming right now, don't worry, because we're going to go through this a lot in this course and in the subsequent courses, so you'll find yourself becoming familiar with it very quickly. Now, there are other types of selectors that are also available in CSS, but in this course and in the two after this, we're just going to be focusing on elements and classes as selectors. And as you're starting out working with CSS, that's really where you should put all of your focus. Then you can work with the more advanced selectors a little bit later. All right, so now that you've seen the basics of how CSS works and the kind of differences that you can achieve with styling, you're ready to move on to learning how to create typography CSS. I've just briefly covered what CSS properties are, and in the next lesson, you're going to start working with some of those properties. And we're going to begin with the most important properties for typography, and they are the font properties. So you'll be learning your first 4 CSS properties, and they're going to be font family, font size, font weight, and font style. And those 4 properties are going to give you your foundation in working with CSS typography. So I'll see you in the next lesson. Hi, and welcome back to Start Here, Learn Typography CSS. In the last lesson, we went through a basic introduction to CSS, and in this lesson, you're going to start writing your own CSS, beginning with the 4 fundamental properties for CSS typography, and they are font family, font size, font weight, and font style. Now, to get started, you're going to need an HTML file like you see on the left side of your screen here. Now, there are 2 ways you can get this. One, you can make a copy of the HTML file that you created in the last course on HTML basics, and you can just delete all of the content, all of those elements that you placed, and just replace it with one paragraph inside your div class wrapper, and then just put any text inside that paragraph that you like. Or if you don't want to do that, you can just download the source files that you get with this course, and this HTML file will be provided for you. Now, this HTML file is already linking in a style sheet, and you went through creating one of these link elements to bring in a style sheet in the last course on HTML basics. So this is loading in this style sheet here, style.css. And there's a little CSS already in there, but don't worry about the contents of that right now. That's just putting a little bit of layout styling into our page, and we're going to be working with layout in another course, so just ignore that for now. Now, what we're going to be doing is creating a selector that will target our paragraph tag, and then we're going to be setting up each of these 4 fundamental font properties to target our paragraph tag. All right, so head into your style.css file, and then below the code that's already there, we're just going to add a P. Now, this P selector is going to look through the HTML of our page here, and every time it finds a P element, a paragraph element, it's going to apply the CSS that we create. Now we need to add an opening curly bracket and a closing curly bracket and make some space inside. Now let's apply our first of the 4 properties that we're going to be working with. We're going to apply a font family property. Now, you'll often hear people referring to just which font they're going to be using. But in CSS, we don't just say font to specify which font we want to use, we say font family. So let's set the font family for our paragraphs. So first we need to specify the property, which we'll do by entering font-family. Now we need to put a colon, and then after the colon, we can specify the value. Now here we need to enter the name of the font family that we want to apply to our paragraph. So let's use Arial. So it's capital A-R-I-A-L. And now to end our line, we need to add a semicolon. Now let's see what it does to our text. So there we go, that's changed the font family from the default that's been set by the browser over to our new Arial font. Now if we inspect our paragraph, we can see that our code here has been picked up from our style sheet. And if we look down here, we can see on the rendered fonts area in the inspector window, it's picked up that we've specified the Arial font family. Now you can change this value to anything that you like. So for example, we might use Times New Roman instead. Now, whenever you have a font family that has spaces in the name, you'll need to use quotation marks. So we'll add quotation marks and we'll put Times New Roman. And now our font has changed to Times New Roman. All right, so next up, let's tweak our font size. Now we're just going to put that back to Arial. And now we're going to set the font size of our text. So just like we did before, we're going to add the property, which is font-size. Now we'll need to add a colon. And then after the colon, we can put a value. Now let's bump this up and make it a little bit bigger. We're going to set the value to a size of 1.5 rem, and I'll explain more about what rem means in a subsequent lesson. So we'll put 1.5 rem, and then you should see the size of our font increase. So there we go, that's bumped it up, and you can see how it's affected the display of our text. Now, font size is very important. It's one of the most important things that you can learn to control in typography. If your font size is too small, then it's very difficult and uncomfortable for a reader to go through. If your font size is too large, then you'll find that you're crowding too many words onto a line to make for a comfortable reading experience. Now, right now, we're working with a paragraph element, and that's what the bulk of the text is going to be in most websites. Now, the size that we're working with now is probably a little bit too big. So let's pull that back down a little bit again. We're going to change this to 1.125 instead. Now, that's brought that down to a far more comfortably readable size for paragraphs of text. Okay, so next let's have a look at the font weight property. Font weight controls how thin or how thick your letters are. So on the next line, let's add in font weight and a colon. Now, the easiest and the most common use of font weight is just to set text to bold. So let's see what happens. So we'll add in a value of bold and save. And now we've just bolded the text that we're working with. If you have some text that's already bolded but you don't want it to be, then you can set the value of font weight to normal. And you'll just get normal thickness in your lettering. As well as using words like normal and bold, you can also use numerical settings for this. And different fonts can support multiple different numerical settings. Now, the word normal is kind of a shortcut for the number 400. So if I put in a value 400, nothing will change. And similarly, the word bold is a shortcut for the number 700. So if I change this to 700, we see the text bolded again. Now, some font families have support for multiple numbers. Now, let's take a quick look at Google Fonts just so I can show you what I mean. So here we are at Google Fonts and we're looking at the font family Open Sans. And in a later lesson, I'll show you how to use this font family in your styles. So as you can see here, we have normal 400, and that gives you the normal weight for this font. We also have bold 700, which gives you the bold weight. But this font also has support for 300, 600, and 800. So when you're using a font like this, you'll very commonly set one of these numbers as the font weight in your CSS. All right, so that covers font weight. Now let's move on to using font style. And you'll use font style when you want to italicize something. So let's add in our new property, font style, and add a colon. And then let's add our value of italic. And now that's italicized all of our paragraph text. And just like I described before with the font weight, if you have some text that's already been italicized and you need to override it, then you can set the value for your font style to normal. All right, so that is all 4 of the fundamental font properties. And there's just 4 of them, but these font properties will actually form the foundation of a huge portion of your website designs. So in this lesson, when we were changing the font family, we just looked quickly at the Arial font and Times New Roman font. Now those 2 fonts, Arial and Times New Roman, are what we consider web-safe fonts because they're already installed on the vast majority of computers. In the next lesson, we're going to go through working with web-safe fonts in more detail, covering which fonts are considered web-safe. And then we're also going to look at how you can use custom fonts. And we took a quick peek at the Open Sans Google font, and we're going to look at how you can take a font like that and use it in your designs. And then we're also going to look at how you can set up font stacks, which will create a series of fallbacks that your design can use just in case the font family that you have specified is not working for one reason or another. So for all that, I'll see you in the next lesson. Hi and welcome back to Start Here, Learn Typography CSS. In this lesson, you're going to learn all about web fonts, custom fonts, and font stacks. Now, the deal with the font that you set in your font family property here is that whatever the font family, like here Arial for example, in order for a user to be able to see text presented with that font, they have to have access to that font's files. And there are 2 ways that they can get access to those files. 1, the font files are already installed on their computer, generally speaking as part of their operating system. And font files that are found in a very high majority of operating systems are what we call web-safe fonts. And for every other font family, those that aren't found on a majority of user systems, we're going to call those custom fonts. You might also hear them called web fonts. And these font files are downloaded on demand by the user when they reach your website. And those font files might get delivered straight from a third-party server like Google Fonts, or they might get delivered from your own server. Now, the first thing that we're going to do in this lesson is go over web-safe fonts and give you a way to look up how reliable different fonts are and how strongly you can consider them to be web-safe. And we're going to do that by visiting www.cssfontstack.com. And this is a great site that's really useful for two reasons. We'll cover the first reason now and the second reason in a little bit. The first reason is it lets you know which font families you're likely to find on Windows machines and Mac machines, and it will give you the estimated percentages of these machines that have these fonts installed. So for example, we have Arial here, which is estimated to be installed on 99.84% of Windows machines and 98.74% of Mac machines. So you can basically be 99% sure that if you're using the Arial font family, then both Windows and Mac users are going to be able to see that font family. Now, on the other hand, if you take a look at Helvetica here, 100% of Mac computers have the font family installed, have those files available, but only 7.34% of Windows users have that file available. So that tells you that if you decide to set a font family property to use Helvetica, then you're going to need to have some type of fallback for Windows machines. So spend a little bit of time going through this website and having a look for font families that you can see have high percentages on both of these operating systems. Now, when you're using a web-safe font, one that you are confident is going to be on the majority of operating systems, all you need to do is specify the font name in your font family setting. So one of the other fonts that we saw is very common on both Windows and Mac is Verdana. So we can just change our value here to Verdana and save, and then our font will show up right away. But what about font families that are not web safe? What about custom fonts? Well, there are two ways that you can get custom fonts working in your websites. One is you can use web fonts delivered to you by a third party like Google Fonts or fonts.com. And the other is you can use something called @FontFace, which looks like this. And with @FontFace, you can define your own fonts, you can provide the files yourself, and you can serve those up to the user. But that's a little bit advanced for what we want to work with right now. So do follow up on @FontFace in your own time and get familiar with how it works. But for now, we're just going to concentrate on web fonts instead. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, web fonts are a lot simpler to use than @FontFace is. And two, you have the advantage when using a web font that there is a good chance the user already has that font cached on their system. So what we're going to do is go over to Google Fonts and we're going to integrate its most popular font named Open Sans. All right, so here we are at google.com/fonts. And because it automatically sorts by popularity, it's showing us Open Sans here at the very top of the list. Now, all we're going to do is hit this little button here to quick use the font. Now, we get the opportunity to select which font files we want to serve up to our users. So for now, we're just going to stick with the normal weight version of the font and the bold weight version of the font. We'll also grab the italicized version of those two weights. And we'll just grab the normal extra bold 800 weight. Now if we scroll down, you can see that Google Fonts has generated this snippet of code for us. So now all we have to do is click in there, copy that code, and then go back to our HTML page. This HTML is just the same as the HTML that you're working with on the last lesson. All I've done is just change a little bit of the content. Now what we're going to do is take the snippet that we just grabbed from Google, and we're going to paste it into our head section below the link element that's already there. Now this URL here is going to pull in all the files that we need to allow a viewer to see the Open Sans font in our website. So we'll save that. And now, if we go into our font family property here, we can now use the Open Sans font name. So because there's a space in between Open and Sans, we're going to use quotation marks, and then we're going to put Open Sans. And then we can see now that's changed the presentation of our font. We have our Open Sans font being loaded and displayed effectively. So you can use that method to implement any font that you find on the Google Fonts website. But now you have a problem that needs to be solved. What if at the moment that your viewer visits your website, the Google font server is down, for example? Or alternatively, what happens if your visitor is one of the 1% that doesn't have the Verdana font installed, for example? Now, this is where font stacks come into play. A font stack is a comma-separated list of font families in order of preference. So if the first one in the list fails, it will go and try to load the second one in the list. If that fails, it'll go to the third, and then to the fourth and fifth, and so on. Now that takes us back to the second reason that CSSFontStack.com is super helpful. And that is, it will provide you with copy-paste font stacks that you can easily use in your code. So now all you need to do is choose the font family that looks most like your preferred font, and then use its font stack in your code. Now these are all grouped by the types of font that they are. So we have sans serif fonts up the top here. We have serif fonts, monospace fonts, fantasy fonts, and script fonts. Now we're using Open Sans, which is a sans serif font. That means we need to choose a font stack that's also sans serif. Now even though these are fallback, we still want to choose one that has a pretty high percentage on both major operating systems. So we could go Tahoma or Trebuchet MS or Verdana. Either of these would be just fine. So let's go with Tahoma. Now if you click this little clipboard here, this will automatically put the font stack into your cache. Now we'll head back into our CSS, and to add in our font stack as a fallback, we're just going to put a comma after Open Sans, and then we're just going to hit paste. Now it's automatically going to include an extra font family property, which we don't need, so just delete that, so that all we have left is these additional font families with a comma in between each name. So now if Open Sans doesn't load, it will try Tahoma next, then Verdana, then Sego, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And then finally, if we can't find any of these fonts, this setting here that says sans serif just tells the system to choose whatever sans serif font is the default for that system. So basically that way you just can't fail. There's always going to be some font that's going to be available in this system that's going to make your text present in the way that you want it to as a sans serif font. All right, so now you know all about web-safe fonts and how to figure out which fonts are web-safe. You know about custom fonts and how to integrate them into your site from Google Fonts. And you also know how to set up font stacks to act as a fallback. So that covers pretty much everything about the actual lettering itself. Now we're going to move on to controlling the sizing and spacing of your typography. Now the first thing that we're going to tackle is vertical spacing in typography. We're going to go through how to control line height, which is the height of each line in your text. And we're also going to go through how to control vertical margins, which is the amount of space above and below each of your text elements. So I'll see you in the next lesson. Hi, and welcome back to Start Here, Learn Typography CSS. In this lesson, we're going to have a very quick look at vertical spacing. And we'll be doing that in the contexts of looking at the CSS properties line height and margin. Now this will be quite quick because we're going to go into more detail on working with these two properties in a later lesson. So in this lesson, we just want to give you a quick insight as to how these two properties work and how they affect text elements. The HTML that we have here is just the same as the HTML that you ended up with in the last lesson. The only difference is we've added a second paragraph here. And the CSS, you can just use the same file that you're working with in the last lesson and just build on top of what you already had. All right, now as you can see in our HTML right now, we have two paragraphs. And I want you to have a look at your HTML page in Chrome and then open up the inspector and then just highlight over the top of one of the paragraph tags. Now the highlighting that you're seeing overlaid on top of this paragraph element shows you the spacing that's currently applied to this element. Now the blue section is highlighting the element itself. The orange section is highlighting something that we call margins. Now in CSS, there are two main ways to put spacing around an element. And we're going to go into this more in our later course where we cover layout in depth. But all you need to know for what we're looking at here is that margins are a type of spacing that is added on to the outside of an element. So this first paragraph here, Chrome DevTools is showing us with the little highlighted orange parts that we have external spacing like this applied in the form of margins. Now, if you also have a look down here in this layout window, you can hover over this outer section of this representation of the paragraph's layout so that you can drill down and take a closer look at exactly what is making up the layout of this element. And then also in the Styles tab, what you can see here is CSS that's actually coming from the browser itself. So we haven't written any of this CSS. This is all Chrome's own default CSS. So by default, it includes this margin code here that puts external spacing of 1em both above and below the paragraph. Now this margin is what is used to help create a break in between paragraphs. So if we didn't have a break like that, it would become very difficult to distinguish one paragraph from the next. So to show you what I'm talking about, I'm just going to override both the top and bottom margin. So I'm going to add margin hyphen top 0. And then I'm going to add margin hyphen bottom 0. And now you'll see the space in between the paragraphs disappear. So when you see those paragraphs scrunched up together and hard to distinguish from one another, you can see why even though margins are technically a part of layout CSS, they are very important for typography CSS as well. Now, these two values, margin top and margin bottom, are typically going to be the two that you need to look at most closely when you're setting up the vertical spacing for things like headings, paragraphs, bullet lists, and other kinds of text elements. So that gives you a quick introduction to margins and to how they affect text elements. The other vertical spacing property that you need to be aware of is line height. And we'll just get rid of these margins for now and put that back to its default. Line height is pretty much what it sounds like. Line height is the height of every line of your text. So you can see right now there's a little bit of spacing in between each of the lines in this paragraph. That comes from the fact that each one of the lines has a set height, and that set height is typically entered as a multiple of the height of the letters. So I'm going to show you what it looks like if the line height in these paragraphs is set to be the exact same height as the letters themselves. So I'm going to use the property line-height, and then I'm just going to use a value of 1. So that value of 1 says make the line height exactly 1 times the height of the letters in this element. So now you can see how scrunched up the lines are together. We've still got the vertical margin in between each of the elements, but because our line height is now too small, there's not enough space in between each of these lines. So line height is very important for ensuring good vertical spacing in your typography. And again, we'll cover it in more detail when we go through styling headings and regular text in a later lesson. But just a quick tip, for me personally, my preferred line height is 1.618. Now the reason is 1.618 is the value of phi, P-H-I. And that's a value that's been used in architecture and art for a very long time. And I personally find that using this number is a shortcut to making spacing look good in just about anything. All right, so that gives you the basics of working with margins and line height to control vertical spacing with typography. Now you might have noticed something interesting here with our line height, and that is that we did not include a unit. We didn't include px for pixels or rem or em or any other unit. And that's because your decision to use a certain type of unit or to not use any unit at all can have a significant effect on how your entire page functions. So in the next lesson, we're going to talk about the units that you can use in typography and when you should choose which type of unit and for what reason. So I'll see you there. Hey, welcome back to Start Here, Learn Typography CSS. In this lesson, we're going to go through the different kinds of units that you can use when you're setting up your typography. The 3 units that you're probably going to run into the most in your web design career are px for pixels, em or em, and rem or rem. And probably the best way to explain what these different units are is to just show you some examples. So in our HTML on the left here, we've just got 3 paragraphs of identical text. Each one is wrapped in a div with a separate class. In the corresponding CSS, we have 3 different font sizes applied. Our first paragraph is using a font size of 18 pixels. Our second paragraph is using a font size of 1.125 em. And our third is using a font size of 1.125 rem. Now, just give you a quick overview of what each of these 3 are. When you use a pixel unit, you are specifying the exact number of pixels that you want a font size to be. So your letter should be exactly 18 pixels in size, no matter what other things may change. An M unit, on the other hand, is a multiplier. An M unit looks at whatever the default font size would be, and then it multiplies it by the given value. Now in this case, the default font size for each one of our paragraphs is just coming from the browser defaults. So let me show you the current settings for my Chrome browser here. So we have 16 pixels. And at this moment in time, pretty much every browser has a default font size of 16 pixels. So when you use an M unit, you're multiplying whatever the default font size is by the value that you provide. For this paragraph, the default font size is 16. You multiply 16 by 1.125, you get 18. So that's why this paragraph here has come out at the same size as this paragraph here. Our rem unit works almost exactly the same. The only difference is that a rem unit doesn't care what the default size of the current element is. It only cares what the font size is for the root element of the document. And the root element of any HTML document is the HTML element. So that is this element here, the topmost element. Now, unless you specifically set a font size for the HTML element, it's also going to just inherit its font size from this browser setting. So our third paragraph is taking this root font size of 16 pixels. It's multiplying it by 1.125 rem, and that's evaluating out to a font size of 18 pixels. So at first glance, all three of these look the same, but behaviorally, they're quite different. Now, if I bring over the browser settings once again, and I change this font size here, this setting, watch what happens to the three paragraphs on the right. So we'll bump that up to 18 as the default. Okay, so look right away, the font size of the first paragraph has not changed. The second and third paragraphs have. So I'll make that a little larger. Once again, that first paragraph is stuck while the other two adjust. And the same thing happens in reverse. If I drag the font size down smaller, the second and third paragraph change, but the first paragraph doesn't. So if you use pixel values, then you're removing the user's ability to customize their own browser settings. And generally speaking, removing choice from a user who may need to change their browser settings to optimize their viewing experience is a pretty bad idea. So then that shows you why pixels are probably not such a good thing to use, generally speaking, unless you specifically don't want something to change with browser settings. So we're just going to get rid of that CSS, and we're going to get rid of this div. So right now, you're probably wondering, why would you use rem over m units? So once again, we're going to look at an example to show you the difference between the two. What we're going to do is nest another div inside our m div. So both of these have the same class, meaning both of these are going to have that same 1.125 m font size applied. So then we'll do the same thing in the rem div. So we'll just nest that in there as well. And once again, we're using the same class, meaning that both of these divs also have this 1.125 rem size applied to them. So we'll save both of those. Okay, now check out the difference between the two here. Now both of these divs have the same font size applied to them, and they look like they have the same font size applied. However, have a look at our first two divs here. These two have M-based font sizes applied to them, but they look different to one another. Now the reason for that is that M-based font sizes are inherited from a parent to the child, then to the following child, to the following child. So I'll show you in the CSS what we're talking about. So with our first div, I'll just drag it up a little, the font size has been evaluated as 18 pixels. So as we went through before, you've got 1.125 times the 16 pixel default font size for the browser. But then, when we have a look at the nested div, the font size is still 1.125 EM, but this time it's not multiplying itself by the browser default setting of 16 pixels anymore. Now, it's multiplying itself by the 18 pixel font size of its parent. So now its font size has evaluated to 20.25 pixels. And if you were to nest another div inside here, the font size would continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, sometimes that's what you want. Sometimes you do want your font sizing to be a multiplication of the font size that the element already has. But in the majority of cases, it's a lot simpler to just use rem units so that it's easier to keep track of your font sizes. All right, so the next type of unit that we're going to look at is using no unit at all. And to get to the point quickly, the place where you should use no unit at all is with your line height settings. I'm going to show you an example of why that's the case. So we're just going to add a little HTML into our page here. So we have two divs with two different classes, and inside each one we have a heading tag and a paragraph tag. And now we're going to add a little CSS. So just paste this in. All right, so our first div is going to have a line height of 1.3 em, and our second div is going to have a line height of just 1.3. Now let's take a look at the difference. All right, now take a look at what we've got with our first heading here. Even though the line height is set to 1.3 em, there's obviously not enough height to these lines. Each of these lines are overlapping each other, while our unitless line height heading looks just right. And even if we change the setting, let's change it to 1.5, for example, it still doesn't look right with the first div. Now, the reason that this has happened is because what we've done here by applying a line height to our div of 1.5 em is we've actually set a fixed line height for everything that happens in this div. So you recall from before that an em unit multiplies the font size of the element it's applied to. And we know that the font size of this div here evaluates out to 18 pixels. So that means that the line height for any element that's in this div is going to be set to 1.5 times that amount, or in other words, 24 pixels. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about a paragraph of text or a heading, the line height is going to be 24 pixels no matter what you do. And as you can imagine, it's generally not a good idea to have a fixed line height that applies to every element in a page. Now, with our unitless line height down here, on the other hand, we still have a multiplier. The line height you end up with is still going to be 1.5 times something, but the difference is it'll be 1.5 times its own font size. So in this case, our line height for our heading here is 1.5 times the size of the heading itself, not the font size of the overall div. So just to recap, when you use a unit, you have a fixed font size that applies itself to everything inside that element. But when you have unitless line height, you have a fluid line height that will differ depending on the font size of each individual element. All right, so that gives you the essentials on using pixel units, em units, rem units, and using no unit at all. And there's just one more type of unit that we're going to cover very quickly, and that is viewport units. So we're just going to delete all of this CSS, and we'll get rid of all of these divs. And instead, we're just going to have one paragraph of text added back in. A viewport unit will allow you to size your text relative to the size of the viewport. So let me show you what I mean. So we're just going to apply a font size to our paragraph here, and let's set it to say 20 VW. A VW stands for viewport width, and whatever number you put before the VW unit basically acts as a percentage. So in this case, our font size is going to be 20% of the width of the viewport, which is pretty much going to be humongous. But just to show you. So there we go. That's humongous, but it's relative to the viewport. Now let's just bring that down to something a little bit more rational. Let's try 3. Now, as I change the size of the viewport, you'll also see the size of the text change. So as the viewport gets bigger, so does the text. As the viewport gets smaller, so does the text. Now, the place that this can be particularly useful is when you start to work with responsive typography. So making sure that when a viewer is looking at your site on quite a small screen, you can responsively resize the text so that it's still very readable for them. Okay, so that gets you across the most important concepts to be aware of when you're deciding which units to use with your typography. Now, where that should all really start to solidify and come together and really make sense for you is when you start to use it practically. And that's what we're going to be doing in the next lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to take the HTML that you produced in the last course on HTML basics. It'll be fleshed out a little bit more so you have a few more typography elements to work with, and we're going to apply typography to it. So I'll see you in the next lesson. Hi, welcome to the final lesson of Start Here, Learn Typography CSS. Now, so far you've learned all about what CSS is and how to work with its syntax. You've learned about CSS Font Properties. You've learned about web-safe fonts, custom fonts, font stacks. You've also learned about vertical spacing in typography, and you've learned about different types of units. Now in this lesson, we're going to take everything that you've learned and we're going to put it into practice by styling the typography for this HTML page here. Now this is the same HTML that you created in the last course and that you've been using throughout this course. So you've got the same head section, you've got this same div class wrapper inside the body section. And then for the purposes of this lesson, we've added in a bunch of extra text. So what we've done here is add a bunch of headings and paragraphs. And then we've got each level of heading 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then all the headings grouped together, and I'll explain why that's done that way a little bit later. Now, as for our CSS, we have the same style.css file, but one thing has changed. Instead of the max width here being set to 35 rem, we've got it set to 45 rem. So right now, everything is just set to default. There's nothing in this typography that has been customized in any way. And we're going to start styling our typography by selecting and applying a font family. And the reason that you do this first is the decisions that you make on font size and weight and what have you will often have to depend, at least to a degree, on the font family that you choose. Some fonts are a little bit bigger than others, some are a little bit smaller than others, even if all the settings are the same. Some are heavier, some are lighter. So it's always a good idea to start by adding in your font family first. And the font that we're going to use is Railway from Google Fonts. So using the same method that we did in a previous lesson, go to Google Fonts and search for Railway. And then you're going to check normal 400 italic, medium 500, semi-bold 600, bold 700, and ultra bold 900. Then click this snippet down here and copy it. And then back in your HTML, after the link element that is connecting your style sheet, paste in the snippet that you got from Google Fonts and save. Now in our CSS, we're going to apply that Railway font to everything throughout our entire website. And we're going to do that by setting a font family on the body element. So everything in your site is going to be contained in the body element, so everything will be affected. So we'll set up our body selector, we'll add our font family property, and then we'll set our Railway font name as the value. Now save, and you should see the Railway font applied to your whole website. All right, so there we go. There's our new font is applied to all of our headings and to all of our paragraphs. All right, so hopefully from the lessons that you've done so far, you should know what the next step is, and that is to set up a font stack. So we're going to go to cssfontstack.com, and we're going to choose an appropriate font stack to fall back on. And probably the one that's most similar to our Railway font would be Trebuchet MS. So we'll copy that font stack. And then we'll paste it into our font family property here. And delete that extra font family property we don't need. Just replace it with a comma. And now there's our full font family all set up. All right, the next thing we're going to do is set a default font size for all of the regular text on our page. This isn't going to affect our headings, but it'll affect our paragraph tags, and it will also affect any other type of text element that goes into the site. Now, we're just working with paragraph tags to keep things a little bit simpler, but this will also affect things like unordered lists and block quotes, for example. Now, you remember from our lesson on the units to use with typography that we don't want to set a base font size in fixed pixels because we want to make sure that a user can have some control over the display size of their text. Instead, we're going to set our font size in rem units. So also here in the body selectors style, we're going to add our font size property and we're going to set it to 1.125 rem. So there you can see that that has increased our font size a little bit. Now that 1.125 rem is the equivalent on default settings to 18 pixels. And we've gone with that because nowadays the default of 16 pixels can be a little bit too small. Now you'll notice here that we're setting the font size against the body element. It is also possible to set a site-wide font size by using the HTML element, but there's a good reason that we haven't done that. And it's to do with creating layouts that are flexible, responsive, and scalable. And that's something you can learn about in the course that comes after this one. But for now, just make a mental note of what we've done here with setting the font size on the body element, and you'll learn why that does matter when you come to do the course on learning how to do CSS layouts. All right, so next up, we're going to apply a site-wide line height. So once again, inside the body element, we're just going to add our line height property, and we're going to set that to a value of 1.618. Don't worry too much about how that line height looks on headings because we're going to set that line height separately in a little bit. This line height is for regular text like paragraphs. Now, I personally like a line height of 1.618 or phi, but you can feel free to set that to whatever you think looks right. All right, so that's all of our body defaults in place. Now we're going to start styling the headings. Now, if you take a look at the headings here, there's a couple of things that are deliberately done with how this dummy text is laid out. For each one of our headings, I've made sure that we have an example of each one wrapping onto multiple lines. Now you need to do this so that you can check that the line height is good for that heading. If you're only testing your typography on single line headings, you'll never know if your line height is any good. And I also have these headings in between paragraphs of text because most commonly, headings will be placed above paragraphs of text to introduce different sections. And part of the process of creating your typography is making sure that the headings look right leading into paragraphs. And then after that, the last thing that we've got is each heading stacked one on top of the other. Because another way that you'll commonly see headings used is to create headings and subheadings. So for example, someone might use an H1 element to create a main headline, and then right underneath that, they might use an H2 element to create a subheading. So you have to make sure that headings look good when they're stacked one under the other. All right, now to get the ball rolling with our headings, the first thing that we're actually going to do is just set the line height for all of these headings back to a setting of normal, because as I mentioned, the 1.618 line height isn't really suitable for headings. So we're just going to put them back to their defaults. And we're going to do that with this snippet of code. Now, whenever you see multiple selectors separated by commas, that means that this style will apply to all of those selectors. So line height normal will now apply to all 6 different types of headings. Now this is just in here temporarily. We'll get rid of it once we've put line heights in for all of our headings. Now the other thing that we're going to do is set the margins for our headings to 0. Now this just helps to get rid of the extra spacing that we have in between headings and paragraphs and in between headings and other headings. So it just puts us back down to a blank slate so that we can build up from scratch. All right, so now we're going to add the font weights that we want for each one of our headings. And we're doing font weights first because the size and the spacing that we have for each one of our headings might change depending on the font weight that we give to each one. So we're going to make our H1 level heading, the highest level heading, the heaviest. So we'll create our H1 selector and our font weight property, and we're going to set it to 900, which is ultra bold. Then for our next heading, for our H2 heading, we're going to do the same thing again, add our font weight. And this time we're going to set the font weight to 800. And this is just going to help a little bit with differentiating between the main headline of a page and a subheader. Now we'll add in our H3, which we'll set to font weight 700. Once again, that will help to make it look a little bit less important. Still clearly a heading, but a little bit less important. And we're going to have H4 also set to font weight 700. So just copy and paste that and change the selector to H4. Now H5, we're going to drop down our font weight once more. I'm going to set that to 600. And then for H6, we're going to use the lightest font weight of 500. So it's still a little heavier than the regular text font weight of 400, but it's the lightest of all 6 headings. Okay, so that is our font weight setup for all of our headings. Now we can set up our font size. By default in a browser, to me, headings are a little bit weird. The 2 smallest headings, heading 6 and heading 5, are actually smaller than regular text. And to me, that doesn't really set them aside as headings. So the first thing that I want to do is increase the size of the H6 heading so it's not smaller than the text that it's supposed to be introducing. We're going to set it to font size 1.25 rem. And now for our H1 level heading, on the other end of the spectrum, we want to make it nice and big so that it stands out as a proper headline. And for this one, we're going to set font size 3.3 rem. All right, so now we've got a nice big prominent heading. Now that's a great size for introducing an article or welcoming people to a business page, for example. And once again, this can be down to your tastes. You don't have to do it the exact same way that I'm doing it. So now that we've got our highest font size and lowest font size, we can fill in the remaining font sizes so that we have a gradual shift from the largest font size down to the smallest. So let's set our H2 to font size 2.3 rem. H3 will be 1.85 rem. H4 will be 1.55 rem. And H5 will be 1.4 rem. All right, so now we've got a nice gradual shift in the size and the weight of our headings. Okay, now we're ready to set the line heights for our headings. And we're going to go up here and we're just going to comment out this margin setting. Because with everything crunched up, it can make it a little tricky to decide on good line heights. Now what we're shooting for is to set a line height for each one of our headings that just looks right. So for our H1 tag, we're going to set a line height of 1.35. All right, so just show you that full screen. So there we go, that's nice and readable. There's a good amount of space to allow for easy reading from one line to the next. For our H2 headings, we're going to have line height 1.45. H3 will be 1.6. H4 will be 1.7. H5 will be 1.6. And H6 will also be 1.6. All right, so let's check out what we've got. All right, so each one of our headings now has a nice comfortable amount of space in between one line and the next. So the only thing left to do now is to get the margins right. At the moment, the spacing in between our headings is not quite right. And also, the spacing in between headings and paragraphs is not quite right. So before we do that, we're going to go back up to our style here for all our headings. We can get rid of this line height normal now because we have a line height for all of our headings. And we're going to re-enable setting these margins to 0 so that we're building up from a blank slate again. Now we only want to add a top and bottom margin to our headings. We want to leave the left and right margins set to 0. So we're going to use some shorthand. So for our H1 tag, we'll add our margin property. And then we're going to put in two numbers. We're going to put 0.8 em, then we're going to make a space, and we're going to put 0. Now this is a shorter way to set the vertical margins and the horizontal margins. This first number here sets our vertical margins. So both the top and bottom margin will be set to 0.8 em. The second value here sets our horizontal margins. So the left and right margins will have a value of 0. And you'll notice that this time we're using the M unit. And that's because we specifically want to size our margins depending on the font size of the heading. So to speed things along a little bit, you can just copy this whole line, paste it down into your H2 tag, and change this first value to 1. Now we'll do the same thing for the H3 tag. We'll change that to 1.3. H4 will be 1.5. H5 will be 1.6 em. And H6 will also be 1.6 em. All right, so now let's see what we have. All right, so now we've got some really nice spacing around the outsides of our headings. It's got a good amount of vertical gap in between each of the headings and the paragraph tags. And when we go down and look at our headings stacked on top of each other, you can see that we have a nice graduation of spacing. The font weight is flowing smoothly, the font size is flowing smoothly, and so is the vertical spacing in between these headings due to the line height and margin settings that we've implemented. So now our typography is complete. Everything is looking just right. And we'll just have one more step, and that is to delete this snippet of code here. We no longer need those margins because we've set all of the margins for our heading tags. All right, so now you are done. You've completely set up the typography for this basic HTML page. So that wraps up the final lesson of this course. I hope you'll join me in the last video where we're just going to recap everything that you've learned. And then I'll let you know a little bit about what's coming up in the next course in our Start Here series. So I'll see you in the final video. Hey, welcome to the final video in Start Here, Learn Typography CSS. You've gone from an introduction to the absolute bare bones basics of CSS all the way through to completely styling typography on a basic HTML page. So that's a huge accomplishment and you should feel really proud of yourself. So along the way, you learned about CSS Font Properties, you learned about web-safe fonts and custom fonts, and you also learned about creating font stacks for fallbacks. You learned about controlling vertical spacing in typography by using line height and vertical margins. You learned about units, including rem, m, px, and vw, not to mention leaving units out altogether with line heights. And then you put all of that to work to style your own HTML page. So all up, you now have a grasp on the basics of HTML and on CSS typography. And in the next course after this in our Start Here series, we're going to keep building on that foundation. And we're going to go through how you can control layout in CSS. Now, just like we have so far with our Start Here courses, in the next course on layout, we're going to focus on the absolute most essential CSS properties when it comes to controlling layout. So we're going to make sure that when you finish that course, you have the information that you need to create virtually any type of layout. So I hope you had a great time in this course on CSS typography and that you'll join me in the next course, Start Here, Learn CSS Layout. So I'll see you in the next one.